Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Shiko and Narset Unified, a Jeskai Enchantress deck with a really interesting take on Enchantress with a really interesting commander. Now this comes to us from Lexa. Thank you for supporting the channel, Lexa, and if you too want to support the channel and take a look at these deck lists early, you can join us on our Discord. To get to the Discord, you can just join our Patreon, and when you do so, you'll see these deck lists early, talk about new cards, and maybe provide some advice to me and the deck builders. What a fun time. But looking at this deck itself, I really like what we're doing here. I am a huge fan of taking a commander that's new or built to be a very specific kind of commander and just turning them into something else. And when I saw Shiko and Narset, I thought, Spellslinger, which I assume a lot of people also thought. But thinking about them with Enchantress in mind makes a really cool kind of deck that has full of synergies in ways you don't expect and lets you do a lot of really fun things. With that in mind, there's a lot to cover and a lot of ideas that I think work and some things to talk about that may not work. So let's get right into it and take a look at our commander. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Shiko and Narset Unified, and why are they our Jeskai Enchantress commander? Well, they are a human spirit dragon, technically two, but still one creature. They have 4/4 flying vigilance, and they have one incredibly powerful ability. Flurry, which triggers on your second spell each turn, so that first part of the text is kind of redundant, but regardless, whenever you cast your second spell each turn, copy that spell if it targets a permanent or player, and you may choose new targets for that copy. And if you don't copy a spell this way, draw a card. So looking at this, the floor is that if you cast 2 spells a turn, you get to draw a card. That's the floor. And that's already what I would consider to be a pretty good floor most of the time for Spellslinger decks, right? Or in this case, even Enchantress decks, right? If you're trying to double spell and getting a card every time you do so, that's already a big advantage that you can take advantage of. But the alternative is that if you are using a spell that targets, you may make 2 copies. Now the idea here, clearly by Lexa, which I think is great, is to take advantage of this and use a lot of auras that are cards that target, but are permanents and not instants of sorceries. And therefore getting a copy of them creates a token copy of that permanent. Now that can trigger all sorts of things like Constellation, that can add up to your count of enchantments on the battlefield, or it can just get multiple uses of really good enchantments, such as Imprison in the Moon, or a bunch of curses like Curse of Opulence, which I think already is really strong. So the idea is sound. I really like it. I think this has gone in the right direction. Now we're at the next step where we're looking kind of a first draft. Now, I don't know for sure this is the first draft, but it feels like an early draft. We've got 41 enchantments, which feels very high. Even in a typal deck where you really care of one type of card, 41 is a very high number. That only leaves us room for 8 instants and sorceries, 1 artifact, 12 creatures in 1 battle, and 36 lands. We're taking everything in, and then we're going to get rid of what we don't like. And I think this is a very sound approach. I like this approach. My background's in theater, and I've always learned that you give more and then you tone it down. And if you ask people in the Magic community, it's the same basis of trying things. Go wild at first, and then start cutting the ones you don't like. So I have no problem here. It's also what I would consider to be a first draft by looking at the sorceries and instants section, which seems to be mainly, the best spells in the color or cards that kind of go with the synergy. And in artifacts, we have 1 hexproof enabler, no soul ring, nothing like that. To me, it's very straightforwardly, we are trying some things out. I could be wrong, but I think that is true. So let's do what we always do when we look at a deck, and we're going to start with the land count, and we're going to look at the curve. Now the land count I do generally like. 36 lands seems maybe lower for a deck that might want to double spell a lot. But you have to remember, we have a lot of incidental card draw. We have a bunch of cantrips here, and we've got a bunch of other ways to make mana and draw cards. So I do really like the 36 lands. If I was being picky, which I could be, I think we could add at least one MDFC into here with very little trouble. I just think we have the room for it. Why not? And if we use one of the lower mana MDFCs, or we use one of the bolt lands from Modern Horizons 3, such as Witch Enchanter, the opportunity cost of playing it is very, very low, and that can be brought in very easily. Now, looking at the curve is where I see kind of the stress of the deck. We can see this very rectangular curve, which is something I don't particularly like. It means that we're kind of trying everything. It means we're thinking of just the best spells and not necessarily thinking where they're going to fit. Now, I do appreciate that 4 and 5 are the lowest. That is really nice. But it does kind of bother me that 1 isn't necessarily higher, right? Because when we're really wanting to double spell, we're put into a situation where the more low mana spells we have, the better. That's not even including the lack of 0 mana artifacts such as Mishra's Bauble or, I don't know, Zoran Orb. Maybe don't play that one, but it does come to mind because I believe Gitaxian Probe is our only 0 cast spell. And having 1 or 2, 3 or 4 0 cast spells can be very, very useful in getting us just a little further ahead. Obviously, cards like Mox Amber or Mox Opal can be put into this, depending on your budget and depending on the build, with Mox Opal requiring a lot more artifacts, for example. But beyond that, I think it's also worth noting that we have a lot of 4-drops. Now, I'm going to be very specific because I will be introducing a few 4-drops, I think, but I still think we should try to keep it low. These cards are going to have some stress against Shiko and Narset because we almost universally want Shiko and Narset out first, and then we want to be casting the rest of our spells later. And of course, double casting with a 4-mana spell is particularly difficult, so I expect them to be really, really good. Then we have a bunch of 3s, then we have a few 5s. So I think very quickly for my cuts or my opinions on a few cards, I'm going to be generally looking at the higher mana ones. The lower mana cards I'm almost universally fine with. Obviously, some of them can be improved, but I think generally they're very, very nice. The few ones in 3 mana I do want to touch on are specifically Calliphy, I hope that's how you pronounce that, and Catilda, and mainly because they are legendaries. Now, that doesn't feel too much of a problem because we might say, well, Cursed, we're not copying those spells, so them being legendary isn't as important. And I said, let's get back to that later. But I also generally find them to be weaker effects. Calliphy's giving your enchantments a pseudo ward 1 is neat, but I don't really think as important as other things. When we are looking at decks like this, I would say that most of the time our worries are board clears, because of the sheer protection we have, and also because of the nature of stacking a bunch of auras and stuff. We're more worried that someone's going to cast a board clear that destroys all enchantments than we are that someone's going to target down spells one at a time. I should click this so it's a little more centered, but I should also argue that if we are copying our auras, we already have an inherent defense mechanism against target removal. As everyone knows, in Commander, single target removal is quite expensive. You're trading 1 for 1 in a format that you kind of have to go 3 for 1 with your cards to keep up with your 3 opponents. So there's already a downside, but if you are getting rid of one of my 2 Curse of Opulence, I really don't care, right? Like that's a tremendous downgrade in the power of your single target removal, and I think I'm fine with you using that instead of using it on something else. So already I think we can cut this card, and likewise, Catilda feels just generally cute. I think it's fine. I like that there's a disturbed version of it, but even then, I think I would rather a card that is just much more proactive and stronger. Likewise, Detective's Phoenix, I think it is worth noting. I do really like that it is an enchantment it's an aura when cast for Bestow, which means you get 2 copies, and it is a strong card. I struggle to see scenarios where that's going to be good or we're going to be able to bestow without a very reliable way to mill cards into our graveyard, with no Faithless Looting, for example, and others. I don't really see a way to cast the bestow cost. And then I might say, even if you do cast the bestow cost, or if you copy the bestow cost, am I really that interested in that? And I would say no. I would say that would be particularly weaker than it would be in other decks, where the haste would matter way more, where the double spell creating the 2 auras would matter a lot more, to the fact that the Phoenixes would drop as 2/2/2s with haste if the card is removed. That would matter more. 4 power with haste is really unimpressive here, so I feel like this card is asking a lot from us and giving us very, very little. Moving near the end of the creatures real quick, Archon of Sun's Grace really feels like overcosted for what it does. Don't get me wrong, I understand the power of this card, especially in certain metas. I understand how this can flood a board and keep yourself defended. I just don't particularly like it. I think it is a lot of mana for an investment that you're not too interested in, and I think there's a bunch of cards that will do this way, way better with a lot less work. Looking very briefly at the other 4 drops, I am tempted to be a little hard on Control Magic, because Control Magic is kind of an overcosted ability. I know that's wild to say. To take control of your opponent's card seems really crazy, but I just don't think it has the same power it used to. Don't get me wrong, this can be used to steal like 2 commanders if you get that double spell off, and that is really nice. But even then, I don't know. I feel like a lot of things have to go right, or maybe I'm just overvaluing the power of the pod that you might bring this to. Maybe this just ends games. I guess that's the idea. Is in lower power pods, this just ends games, and higher power pods, they're not really going to care, right? And I think that kind of struggle in a deck that otherwise wants to slowly put the screws on your opponent, to invite your opponents to take you out of the game so they get control of their creatures back, feels really rough. I do have to remind myself that if you do regain control, because control magic ceases to exist, I think you regain control of your creatures if that player goes away, but still, I might be being overly harsh on this, because I do note it is really, really strong, but 4 mana does feel particularly strong. Likewise, Kidnap feels like just the worst version of a card I just didn't like. So if you do have to cut one, I feel like Kidnap should be one of it. I just wish these cards were lower mana or more devastating, but I really think you're trading 1 for 1 even with the bonus copy spell, so I don't particularly like it. Sage of the Revelry and Tempest Technique both feel really, really good. I will note for both cards, I really want some more evasion and some more creatures for them to be good, but I think the floor is fine. I would keep definitely one of them. I think I would like you to test this card a lot before like doubling down on it, because I think this deck can use it effectively, but I imagine a lot of the cases you're not going to be getting as many copies of this card as you would like. And maybe that's enough, but I am concerned that it's not. So once again, 4 mana is a lot. Otherwise, I'd be a little less harsh on it. I think Ghostly Dancers is fine. I feel like this feels a mix of that, is it the Sigil of the Empty Throne or something like that? The 5 mana create a 4/4 angel whenever an enchantment enters play. It might be whenever you cast an enchantment. But I feel like this is kind of the worst version of that, where you get weaker creatures than the 4/4 flyings, and in exchange you get yourself a creature that can attack, but then you're also there can be removal that targets this a lot easier, with the other benefit that you get an enchantment from your graveyard to your hand. I don't know. I think it's really, really close, and I feel like this is kind of clunky versus everything else you could have in here. Really cool art, but I do want to be a little picky on this. The rest of these, I think, are generally cute. I do like the curses a lot. I do like Treachery in what it does, because untapping a bunch of lands for generating mana to double spell or triple spell or something like that is really, really cool. So I'm willing to say this is a very, very good card. But Curse of Bloodletting very specifically stands out to me as maybe the weakest of the curses here, because it is interesting to see that I don't think this does enough. What it does is paint a target on an opponent, especially if you give them the copy as well, but you can't really deliver the pressure as well as someone else can. So it's more like marking a target for your opponents to go after. And your opponents may not be incentivized to do so. So it is a bit of a political card that I would have to see in action to really judge. But I do find it, like the whole curse package is really, really nice. I do love the idea of cursing our opponents and getting the most out of them. I think we have here a few impetus cards. Once again, I kind of want to know how reliably these cards will function. They're all usually 3 mana, and they're cards I don't always love. I think they remade a black one where it would kept getting like re-enchanted to more creatures, and I did really like that. But the rest of these really do feel like slow removal, as goading your opponent's creatures will tend to get them killed, and then you kind of lose that ability. Whereas, I mean, if you just double spelled on the Swords to Plowshares that you might cast, which notably is not in the deck, but if you were to do that, wouldn't that do the same job for a fraction of the mana? I do understand that it's not as flavorful, but it is worth noting that it would be a lot better most of the time. Like, do note that, like, these cards can be really, really cool in the right boards. Like, Martial Impetus is really, really strong when you give it to the token player and, you know, you give them basically an anthem for the turn so they can smash face. But if that circumstance doesn't really exist, even if you have an opponent that has, like, 4 7/7s, like, this card stops doing as much, because attacking with 4 7/7s or 4 8/8s, right, isn't that big of a difference. And so your opponent is not incentivized to send all of the rest of the creatures at your opponents when they could just send it at you, for example. It may not be the right call, but it's just something worth considering, right? If you've goaded their creature, and they might seek retribution. So it's not that I want to do the whole thing where I go, well, just play Swords of Plowshares, so much better. I don't want to make that. That's not the argument I want to make. It's specifically that I find these cards are very dependent on the board state, and in a deck that's already very much so like that, I don't like going further into that direction, right? Like, Unable to Scream, for example, is a very, very efficient card I really, really like. But if your opponents aren't playing creatures that you want to enchant with this, it becomes dead in your hand. And that's generally fine, because you might want to use it to double spell later. But the impetus cards start getting trickier, right, in those ways, because it's a lot harder to do that when they're 3 mana. And it might not feel as good to be doing this when you're kind of stuck using these cards and planning your turns around them, when you could be thinking of combinations that are way, way more impressive that the deck can push out. Otherwise, I think generally I like almost all of the enchantments here. There's obviously a lot of things that, once again, my argument is not just play Swords to Plowshares, but there are cards that just function as weaker removal. And I think that's fine. I think a lot of these are very flavorful. I think they're very strong. I think we just need to test a lot of these before we go any further, right? Change of the Rocks is a really, really cool card because it's going to work really well with our Constellation and Enchantress effects, in addition to taking out your opponent's creatures in a deck that probably can have 2 mountains out, and forcing your opponents to blow up your lands to get back our creature is a big ask, I would say. So I do appreciate that. All right, let's go into additions because I have quite a few. So first and foremost, I think notably missing is Mesa Enchantress. Something I want to talk about building something that is tuned differently than the commander wants you to, is that you tend to get access to colors you don't expect. Jeskai Enchantress is not really a thing that you expect to see because there's a lot less support for it than, let's say, Bant Enchantress, even Mardu Enchantress, even Abzan Enchantress, right? These things we get a lot further usually using green than we do with the other I said Mardu, but like even that has a commander that's built for it. So when we do an off meta or an off color thing, we still need to look at some classes that we need to play, or classics we need to play. And Mesa Enchantress is a really, really good example of that. We should just be playing it because that card advantage is just going to be very much so worth it. However, and this is the big thing I really like about this deck, we simultaneously need to acknowledge the cards that we are gaining that we wouldn't otherwise have in enchantment decks. And Whirlwind of Thought is just a really, really good example of that, right? Outside of 4 to 5 color decks, Whirlwind of Thought is just inaccessible to anyone who's not in Jeskai. So why not play this? This is a card that gets to power up all of your enchantments like an Enchantress effect. But in addition, it powers up all your other non-creature spells as well. That's really, really cool. That's something I really like. And though, once again, I said it is 4 mana and it does kind of have some conflict with your commander, it does nicely kind of solve one of the things your commander does. Remember, at the floor, your commander draws you an extra card on double cast, and Whirlwind says you get to draw a card on most casts. And I really, really like that. Following the card draw theme, I thought SRAM would be a really easy inclusion that I also missed. Once again, just like lowering the mana cost, triggering off a lot of things in your deck, and rewarding you for being aura heavy. Just getting that extra draw to get your land drops, to get your deck going is just really, really important, and I think it's very valuable to have that here. One that I noticed, this is another 4 mana card. This one I'm not sold on, but I did want to talk about it, is Voracious Bibliophile. Now, I know I've seen it around like on EDH Rec and other places, mainly because it's like a precon, it comes in the precon, and therefore you tend to see it. And this is probably just a little overcosted for this ability. I still think it's really valuable. I like the fact that it scales with our commander really, really neatly. I like it that it scales with a lot of our cards in ways that we don't expect. But I also like that it's an evasive creature with vigilance. I like the fact that we can stack our auras onto this creature and get just a really decent attacker with very little effort. And I think that's worth considering. It might be too much mana, but I did want to name it. Something I did want to note here as well, this is once again probably in the air because it's a new Jeskai card, but it really caught my eye. Rediscover the Way represents two, like look at the top 3, draw one of those cards, and then a big payoff for casting non-creature spells. And I think this is interesting because before I've talked about cards like Phyrexian Arena and a lot of these other upkeep cards that draw you a card as something you're probably not going to get a lot of triggers out of. And Rediscover the Way is basically just that, where you have 2 turns of gaining card advantage with some digging involved and then a payoff. And that can be really positively compared to like Read the Bones, a card I really, really like. So with that in mind, and on the enchantment side in an enchantment deck, I think this card is really, really strong. But like other enchantments in this deck, it gets really good if you copied it. But you might say, well, Curse, this isn't an aura. How are we going to copy it? Let's talk about other copy abilities. This, I think, is really, really important because as much as, if you watch my channel, you know I don't tend to like copy effects, like doublers, I should say, because I think they tend to be more win more, or they kind of like work in a way that's clunky until you get the first one, and then the second or third one, you know, they stop mattering as much. They get ridiculous, don't get me wrong, but at a certain point, it's just redundant. So I like running low amounts of them. But here, we're not looking at doubling, we're looking at copying, which gives us a much wider kind of space to play in. And these cards not only work really well with your commander, they work well as alternatives to your commander, which is really, really nice. So we can have cards that function to make your deck function and double your commander should they're out. So like, I love this. So Tygam, really easy. Doubles spells but suspends one of them, still really, really cool. And for a mythic, pretty cheap. Flamehold Grappler, once again, a very decent body on a creature that lets you double spell. And like the way this works is you're going to cast this first, and then whatever you cast next gets doubled by Flamehold Grappler and potentially doubled again by your commander. That's really, really strong. 3 copies of the spell is fantastic. Likewise, one I think is the strongest or the most important one and the most traditional doubler is the Ondu Spirit Dancer. I think this was one of those cards that got printed, and it has been printed again, which is notable, but when it first printed, it had a really high cost and was seen as really, really powerful, but I didn't really see it around, and it started dropping in price, maybe because it fell out of the collective memory because of the sheer number of cards we tend to see. I do want to note, this is really good. This is really, really strong in a number of ways. And I think you could play it pretty safely in a deck like this because, yes, it costs a lot to double cast with this, but you can still just cast this as your only spell and be pretty happy with it, with your opponents immediately having to make decisions because if you don't, if they let this stick around, your next few turns are going to be very, very powerful. So really important and worth considering. Then I have a few cards that I think was just notably missing. Ethereal Armor I think should just be in here. The low cost of it and the fact that of course it's another aura. This lets you double spell easily. It's just strong. I think it's a very, very easy inclusion. Authority of the Consuls is not a card that gets that much better in copies, but same thing, this is a card I just want around to double spell, where the floor of the card is really, really strong, and whatever you cast after this is going to be very good. Likewise, again, Sigarda's Aid. Flurry triggers on your opponent's turns as well, so all that matters is you double cast, and Sigarda's Aid ticks all the boxes as being a low cast spell that can allow you to double cast that turn, or just turning on Flash for the majority of your deck in order to get an immense advantage. Finally, it's against the law for me not to mention Lightning Bolt. Please play Lightning Bolt. You get to play it. I know it's a slot. Right now we don't have a lot of slots, but we do need our deck to interact with our opponents. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere. And if you've never double cast a Lightning Bolt, hooey, it is a powerful effect. And it kind of solves that problem what I said earlier, where if you don't want to play Swords to Plowshares, Lightning Bolt is weaker and still very, very good. So I would 100% recommend that. The last one and the last card I want to suggest is Strike It Rich. I don't know if I like this card. This is one of those cards that is a pseudo free cast, but I think it's worth noting that it enables you to double cast for basically free, and the flashback isn't unheard of something you can do later. I don't know. I don't know if I want to suggest this, but I do think it should be out there. And that's it for Shiko and Narset. Thank you so much for sending this deck. I think it's really, really cool. I'm really excited to see what a future version of this deck is going to look like because I think it has the potential of being very, very fun. And I would say it has a wide potential of power level. We could scale this up, we could scale it down. There's so many directions to go into, and I'm really, really excited to find out. Thank you so much for sending the deck. Good luck and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you and good luck in brewing and building.